Before Banks.
Mr Speaker, my question is directed to the Prime Minister. Has the Prime Minister seen reports that the government intends to introduce a goods and services tax? Is there any foundation to these reports? And if not, can the Prime Minister explain to the House why the government rejects such a tax?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I notice that the Deputy Leader of the Opposition and the Deputy Director of the Federal Liberal Party are saying, and have said now often, that the government will introduce a consumption tax. It will do no such thing. Do no such thing, and it has no intention of so doing. Which I made clear, Mr Speaker, in speeches I gave on this subject on the 11th of February 1987 and on the 5th of May 1990. One to a tax symposium in Melbourne, the first one, the second one the National Press Club on the 9th of May 1990, and that is still the government's position. Now, Mr Speaker, the reason for that is that, unlike the Leader of the Opposition, when the nation's representatives were assembled to consider primary tax changes back at the Tax Summit in 1985, it was not possible to get a discount on wages for the price effect of a consumption tax. The macroeconomic risk to the economy was too great, and it was not proceeded with. It was not proceeded with. And I made clear on that occasion, that there's no way that any government can introduce legislation for such a tax, particularly such a high tax as 15% proposed now, without getting those discounts. Now, Mr Speaker, we've seen opposition to a consumption tax from representatives of the community in recent days, and I noticed the Leader of the Opposition waving a letter at me, or he was trying to, on Friday, saying from the Australian Catholic Social Welfare Commission Thursday, where he quoted the Commission, where it said in its first paragraph, asked me to express their deep and sincere appreciation for the meeting. He's waving this around. The fact that it's written in it was in Vaticanese, seemed to be overlooked in the debate. Now, Mr Speaker,
order. But the House will come to order. The member for Mayo will cease interjecting.
But Mr Speaker, it didn't last long, because even those most gullible people in the press who took that as being the sign of a conducive discussion, but who then failed to take notice of the fact that which had been communicated to the government, that is, it had been a most disruptive discussion, should have their naivety dispelled by this morning's newspapers, where it has "The Church is angry at Cheney's leftist tag," and it says this: We had the member for Pearce on Friday saying this. Now, this is it. You see, all opinion.
Order.
You see,
the Minister will cease interjecting.
Mr Speaker, on Friday, the member for Pearce.
The Leader of the National Party on a point of order.
Standing Order 145. The question specifically related to tax reform. In general, it did not in any way refer to the Social Welfare Commission or the member for Pearce. The answer the Prime Minister is now giving is far beyond the terms of the original question, and you should rule accordingly.
The Prime Minister was asked a question about a goods and services tax, and the Prime Minister is indicating people's views about that. He's in order.
Mr Speaker.
Order.
Mr Speaker, the member for Pearce said this on Perth radio: the Anglican Church, certainly the Catholic Church, which very often I think took a broadly left view of what would help Australia, and then that was responded to. And then this morning he said on Peter Kennedy radio in Perth, he said that I made the point that I thought that there was a left view among many such bodies. Now, I'm sorry, I happen to think that that's the truth, and I say that because of very long experience in dealing with such bodies. I think it's the first time in history the Catholic Church has been pinned as a leftist organisation. And he went on to say this: It is certainly, I think, not helpful to the debate to have a view being put forward by the Catholic Social Welfare Commission, which I think is narrow and I don't think is logical, and I think it is, as I say, very much a view which is conditioned by a left view rather than a Christian view. Now, the thing is, Mr. Speaker, here's Bishop Powell,
the member for the Northern Territory,
an attendee, or shall I say, an attackee of the meeting last week, who was dealt with by the attacker, the member for Pearce, who had this to say. He said, the opposition was trying to hide from the broad church criticism of the goods and services tax by discrediting it as driven by left-wing ideology. A spokesman for the Catholic Welfare Movement, Bishop Pat Power, said yesterday. Bishop Power said he took strong issue with being sidelined as a leftist. If standing up for the poor and needy is leftist, then I could accept the accusation. But he said the church has had a moral obligation to enter the political debate. Bishop Power said such statements were quite out of order and not conducive to dialogue. Mr. Cheney is just trying to discredit us because it helps to put the arguments to one side and avoid the issues. And then went on to say the General Secretary of the Uniting Churches National Assembly, the Reverend Gregor Henderson, said Cheney's comments were a smokescreen. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is the tactic of the Liberal Party. Anybody who asks a question about fight back is perforce a left-winger. All opinion contrary to their own is delegitimate. It's delegitimised. So it's not just an issue that's taken on challenge, it is delegitimised. But then we had the Reverend Anne Wandsworth on Friday from the Uniting Church of Australia.
Order.
She said, and she had to say
the Prime Minister might resume his seat. The member for Isaacs. Order. The Prime Minister might resume his seat. The member for Isaacs on the point
Mr.
of
Speaker.
Order. The member for Banks will cease.
Mr. Speaker, my point of order is under Standing Order 145. The question from the member for Banks was very specific. It related to whether the government are going to introduce a goods and services tax or not. Now, letters relating to various members of our religious groups have got no relevance whatsoever to that question, and I'd ask you to get the Prime Minister to get back to the question.
Order. The Prime Minister was asked whether the government had he seen reports whether they were going to introduce the tax, and if they weren't, why not. The Prime Minister is indicating the views of others about why not, which I also assume are his own views. The Honourable Prime Minister.
Yeah, now there's more of it, of course, you know. Libs hit leftist church critics. Libs hit church attacks fight back. Church attack on fight back grows. Sydney Morning Herald. Catholic bishops attack Cheney. And then we have the Reverend Anne Wandsworth had this to say. She said, fight back is a policy document which the Liberal National Party intends to implement. It is not a philosophical discourse. She said, we're entitled to ask, therefore. Indeed, it is the responsibility of the churches to ask both whether the package will work and, if it will, whether the sort of society which it will eventuate is what we think is appropriate as the context for living as human beings. And she goes on to say, she said, the paper examines that vision, and in doing so we should note the style in which the document is written, a somewhat self-righteous style in many places, claiming the high moral ground. This, it should be noted, does not sit well with what can only be considered the deceptiveness of the pamphlet about fight back, which tells us of all the purported benefits of fight back, but does not spell out the effects of the cuts to government spending and a number of other policy changes which analysts in this seminar have called draconian. Fight back denies the fact that many Australians work harder than is good for either their health or their families. She goes on to say, fight back lacks a genuine vision. Fight back lacks a genuine vision, and she goes on in that vein. Mr. Speaker, it's very obvious that what the government said occurred in that meeting last week was correct. It's obvious by the statements by Bishop Power yesterday, and that those naive people are prepared to read the first paragraph of the letter and take Dr. Hewson at his word, or to please take note. And secondly, that the whole Liberal tactic is to discredit any critic, to say they're either leftists or they're from somewhere else, not that they represent a genuine view in the committee, but to discredit their view so that their criticism can be put to one side, as Bishop Power eloquently said himself. This is the tactic which will be meted out to all the people who dare ask for what is, as the Reverend Wandsworth said, not a philosophical statement but a policy document. And if it is a policy document and the Liberal Party wishes it to be viewed as a policy document, then people will ask questions and make criticisms of it. They should not then be attacked and sidelined and delegitimised, as the Leader of the Opposition and the Member for Pearce now seek to do, branding decent people simply with a tag that they are leftists and therefore not to be taken seriously.
The Honourable Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker.